Hello and welcome to WION. This show is called Gravitas. I'm Aanchal Vora. Over the next 60 minutes, we're talking about two very important subjects that do have a major resonance even in South Asia. First 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about Cold War Redux, is it? NATO is building a massive build-up in Baltic countries. That's right on Russia's neighbor. What's going to be the impact of that in South Asia? The next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about NSG and how New Zealand, it seems, is coming around to support India's bid. It says it will play a constructive role. But what does that mean? All of that over the next 60 minutes. But first up, the headlines. In the biggest ever NATO build-up in Baltic nations, US, UK, Canada and others decide to send 4,000 troops in Russia's neighborhood, saying they fear Russian aggression. But is there more to it? New Zealand's Prime Minister has assured Indian PM that they will play a constructive role for India's entry into the NSG. That after India failed to secure consensus in Seoul recently. Indian police detained a Pakistani diplomat on suspicion of espionage. Because of diplomatic immunity, he was soon released. That as Indian forces spoiled another infiltration bid in Kashmir. Tata Sons hit back, issue statements, call Cyrus Mistri's email leak unforgivable. In a move that could escalate regional tensions, China will carry out more military drills in South China Sea. NATO is building a massive build-up in Baltic nations and also Poland. That is being seen with lots of fear across the world, but certainly also in South Asia. Now, does all of this mean that there is going to be another Cold War all over again? Is it the beginning of another phase of Cold War? India has traditionally been friends with Russia, but now India is seen to be much more closer to the United States. What is India's stand? Where does India stand and where should it? What does all of this mean for South Asia? That's something we're going to be talking about over the next 30 minutes. But before that, let me introduce my guest to you. In the studio, we have Foreign Affairs Analyst, now with WION, Surya Gangadharan. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us. Raymond Vickery is going to be joining us from the United States. And also, we would have a Russian expert joining us in just a bit. But before that, the biggest military build-up by NATO since the Cold War is taking place in Europe along the border with Russia. The build-up could be a belated Western response to Russia's moves in Syria. But there is speculation it's linked to the US elections. Have a look at this report.
The drums of war appear to have been sounded in Europe. NATO allies meeting in Brussels have resolved to challenge Russia's recent actions, including the takeover of Crimea and its operations in Syria.
And I'm pleased to confirm that several nations indicated their willingness to contribute to our presence in the Black Sea region on land, at sea and in the air.
More than 4,000 troops drawn from NATO, along with tanks, artillery and other equipment are being readied for deployment along Russia's borders with Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia. The move comes in the wake of Russia stationing nuclear missiles in Kaliningrad and the high-profile movement of a naval battle group to the shores of Syria. But speculation in the Western media has hinted that the NATO build-up could be linked to the US elections and may be designed to weaken Donald Trump, the Republican presidential candidate who has made favorable comments about the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Our country is so outplayed by Putin and Assad and, by the way, and by Iran, nobody can believe how stupid our leadership is.
It ties in with allegations of a Russian role in the hacking of Democratic Party emails that are seen to have helped Trump and gone against Hillary Clinton. It also ties in with the Western view of Putin, which is generally negative. Bureau Report, WION.
To discuss more on this, we're joined by Raymond Vickery, Senior Advisor of ASG. He's joining us from the United States of America. Mr. Vickery, always a pleasure. He's joining us via Skype. We also are joined by Russian expert Peter Topichikov, Senior Researcher and Associate at a think tank in Moscow. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us, and I do hope that I pronounced that Russian surname correct. We're going to begin this discussion, but before that, let's have a look at some of the information we've managed to put up in terms of what this NATO build-up really looks like, and essentially which are the countries, these Baltic nations that we've been talking about, that NATO nations want to send troops to. Let's bring that graphic plate up for our viewers. NATO essentially says that in 3 of the Baltic nations and in Poland, they're going to be sending 4,000 troops. US to send about 900 soldiers to eastern Poland. UK to send 800-strong battalion to Estonia. And then we believe Germany and Canada as well. Canada to send 450 soldiers to Latvia, and Germany to send 400 to 600 soldiers to Lithuania. So this is what it looks like. UK, US, Germany, Canada, all of these nations wanting to send up their troops to the Baltic nations. This is right on the Russian border, and is something that Russia, of course, is not very happy with. Now, let me bring the first question to you, Surya, here in the studio before we start playing the other information. I want to ask you, what does all of this mean for us sitting in South Asia and for our viewers? The fact that NATO is planning to send 4,000 troops, we're looking at this massive build-up. What are the fears in South Asia?
I don't think it directly impacts on us, but the fact that you have such a build-up happening with respect to 2 countries that India is close to, that does impact on us. And if you look at recent diplomatic overtures that Modi has made and the kind of relationship we are developing with Washington, it does suggest that, perhaps it may give the impression in some quarters that, well, India is with the US on the score. That wouldn't be the case. India would be neutral here because, frankly, what happens on that part of Europe doesn't really impact on us. But yeah, we'll be wanting to know from the Russians how they will react to this. The Americans may want to know from us what are your Russian friends telling you. Or for that matter, they'll want to know, what do you think of what we are doing here, and do you back us? So I think that's where the real dynamics comes in, and how do we play with that? How do you react to what the Russians are telling you, and how do you react to what the Americans are telling you? I think that will be closely watched.
It could be a position of privilege for India, because India has certainly gained importance on the international stage. But it's also a tricky situation for India, one of the major nations in South Asia. Let me go to Raymond Vickery. Mr. Vickery, I'd like to ask you, what NATO essentially is saying on record is that they are scared, they're worried that Russia might expand or might be aggressive, like it has been, according to NATO, in Crimea, in other former Soviet states. But if this step had to be taken, why was it not taken in 2014? It seems a little belated. Why now?
Well, this has been going on for some time, and you're not talking about massive numbers when you're talking 900, 450, and so forth. What is being done is to make it plain to Russia that the changing of European borders by force is completely unacceptable. NATO is an entirely defensive alliance. It has no offensive measures at all. So what's going on here is that Russia has, for the first time since World War II, actually changed international borders by force, not the rule of law, but by force. And it's not just Crimea and Ukraine in that regard, it's Georgia. And they have made threats against the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So what is being done is to make it plain that the movement by force to change borders is unacceptable. And I should think that that's something very important to India as well. India has problems both with China and Pakistan in regard to borders. And the clear position of India has been that these borders should not be changed by force, but ought to be done, if at all, when there is a negotiation settlement, and the rule of international law. So to make a great deal out of this is wrong. And I want to say also that it's absolutely wrong to link this to the U.S. elections. What's going on between the United States and Russia in terms of troops, in terms of NATO, is entirely too serious to be affected by politics either on the Republican or the Democratic side. So I should think, yes, India should have an interest here. I don't think India should just say, no, we really don't care, because that's not in that part of the world, because the principles at stake that you don't change borders by military force is applicable across the board.
All right, let me take that to our Russian guest, and then I'll come back to Syria and talk about how much stake India has in it or not, because Mr. Vikri, Russia says that in Crimea, if you're talking about changing borders, there was a referendum. Let's go to the Russian guest. If you'd allow me to call you by your first name, it's easier on our tongue, Peter.
It's fine.
Yeah, what is Russia's position on this massive build-up that the NATO is proposing in Baltic nations? Why do you think NATO is suddenly making this announcement?
First, I believe that these decisions to upgrade the military presence in Eastern Europe were made in Warsaw NATO summit. So it's a slow process to coordinate efforts of all NATO allies. So it took some time for NATO to decide and to start deployment. So from the official Russian point of view, it's irrational act and it's quite aggressive. And of course, Russian officials will think about how to respond to this. But I wouldn't share this opinion because it's, from my point of view, it's a wrong way of development of affairs in Eastern Europe. Started with Russian military exercises, heavy, very massive military exercises in Eastern European part of Russia. Of course, started with situation in Ukraine, but not in Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, Georgia, and I would agree with that. But the response from the NATO side was mostly military. So
I'd like to ask you, if I may come in, I'd like to ask you if you could draw certain scenarios for us as far as what are the possible ways Russia can respond to this NATO build-up?
More active military exercises, more rapid change and update of military hardware in Eastern European part of Russia, and more clear military signaling to Western partners that Russian officials will be ready to defend their core interests in that part of our country. So anyway, we are going to discuss possible military escalation in the near future in that part of the world.
Right. So in a way, there is a precedent as well, Surya, because Russia did move the aircraft carrier to Syria, and I think that has also irked Americans, as also the allegation by the United States of America that Russia is hacking into the websites of the political parties in the United States. Right before I come to that, let's pull up this graphic that we've made of this recent rivalry between NATO and Russia. NATO and Russia have always been at loggerheads, but essentially what's really happened in the recent few years, if the production control room will pull that graphic up, NATO suspended ties with Russia after Crimea annexation, as it says. That happened in April 2014. And not just that, NATO also accuses Russia of targeting civilians in Syria. Now, there was it seems an understanding between the US and Russia when it came to targeting ISIS, a tacit understanding. But since then, the US has been accusing accusing Russia as well of targeting the opposition groups in Syria and the civilians, as also of violating Turkish airspace in October, November, and then of 2015, and then in January 2016. Turkey, of course, is a member of NATO. NATO opposed also to Russia moving a Navy battle group to Syrian shores, and that essentially was the aircraft carrier that I just mentioned. US accuses Russia of cyber attacks on political organizations. So that's what we're here talking about. A lot of the reports that have been coming from Western media say that essentially the fact that Trump has been making pro-Putin comments, there's some sort of a larger electoral conspiracy at play in order to defame Trump. Is that what is at play here, and how does that connect really to the announcement of NATO build-up?
Well, I think the remarks that Mr. Trump has made about President Putin are in a sense unprecedented, for an American presidential candidate to make, because we know the kind of rather adversarial relationship that the US and Russia have had, whether it was during the Cold War or even subsequently. There has been a sense that US and Russia, despite Russia no longer being the USSR, the adversarial relationship continues. And I think recent American forays into what were the former Soviet republics hasn't helped matters either. And in that sense, the rivalry continues, And when an American presidential candidate goes and makes these remarks, I think within the establishment in the US, it must have come as a shock. What on earth is this man up to? He's overturning everything the way we've seen Russia all these years. So those are issues there. Whether they have actually influenced this movement of the buildup of NATO forces, I think that's another matter. Yes, what Mr. Vikri has said, that there is this entire Russian kind of aggression that has happened, Crimea and all that. Those are reasons. But one wonders where this is going really. Where does this entire build-up, what is it going to lead to? I mean, that would be the more relevant question here.
Yeah, what would it lead to? But I think let's bring that a little towards the end. Perhaps we can get a final word, because I do want to talk a little about the fear in the United States that Russia is hacking into into the computers of political organizations. Let me go back to Raymond Vickery. So if you follow Russian television, then you'd see during the time the primaries were on, there was a certain sense that perhaps some of the Russian media was actually pushing for Bernie Sanders, and now it seems that they seem to like Trump more. What do you make of these reports that we, even in India, sitting here, read that the Democrats are very unhappy with the statements that Trump has made, and that there is a certain sense of sort of putting Trump and Putin together for electoral gains?
Well, it's absolutely true, as your guest has said, that what Donald Trump has said is absolutely unprecedented in American politics, to be praising this kind of action in hacking into the Democratic emails, and it is plain. All the security agencies of the United States say that there is a Russian hand behind that hacking, and not to denounce it as Trump should have done is amazing, much less to say, yeah, well, maybe they can find out more, and really encouraging it. This kind of interference by one country in the election of another is designed to undermine democracy. And India has a huge stake in that. And I want to just say, there was an aside comment, I believe, a while ago saying that there was something lawful about the invasion of Crimea because there was some sort of referendum that was held. Well, that's just not a part of international law. You don't go into another country and say, we'll hold a referendum, and therefore we're unable to take it over. All you have to do is look at Kashmir to see the falsity of that kind of approach. So this is an unprecedented way. It's a serious thing. We are hopeful, I think, that President Putin will come to his senses, and see that this is not the way to conduct international relations.
Right, Mr. Vikri, you know what I was trying to also ask you is what Putin, in fact, just a short while ago has said, that the fact that there are media reports in the US linking Russia to the campaigns going on there and imagining that Russia can influence the outcome in the US elections is hysteria. So he calls it hysteria. So my specific question to you is whether this announcement by NATO that talks about this massive build-up, whether that's linked to the elections in the US, because we're not hearing too much from the European members of NATO. They're being rather quiet about this massive build-up.
No, they're not being quiet at all. In fact, if you just go on the internet, you'll see that the UK particularly stepped up, that Poland and others have stepped up. So they're not being quiet. But this is not linked to what's going on. These kinds of things with NATO, as another one of your guests has just said, have taken place over a period of years since Putin started this with Georgia and then going into Crimea, then going into eastern Ukraine, then threatening Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Balkan states. He has made it quite plain that he feels that the demise of the USSR was one of the great tragedies of history. And to some degree, he is trying to regain lost glory, if you will, by these threats, intimidations, and moving forward. So all that's happening, these troops which you're talking about are not a massive buildup. 900 people, 1,000. They would be tripwires to show the seriousness of defending NATO allies, but it is by no means a massive buildup. And
right, sir, but you know, it's not just 900, 300. There's also a lot of artillery here at play. 4,000 is what NATO says, and it also says that if need be, about 30,000 plus can be sent. Let me go to the Russian guest here to sort of get a response from Moscow. I'd like to ask our Russian expert on the panel, is there a sense in Russia, as we've heard Raymond Vikri also talk about, that Russia wants to expand and the fear essentially is Russia's expansion? What's the sense in Russia of why NATO is making such announcements?
I believe that for the Russian Federation, expansion, it would be and could be extremely expensive from the point of view of policy and economy. And it's already very expensive for us as for common citizen. So from this point of view, maybe the threat of expansion or the threat for Baltic states or for Ukraine, it's some kind of style of dealing with our neighbors for Kremlin and for Vladimir Putin and his friends. But it couldn't be a Russian long-term policy, and there is no way for any kind of restoration of the Soviet Union, because it's just impossible for our economy. Our economy is not so strong as economy of Germany or France or of course as United States. For us, this kind of competition with Western country would be suicidal, I would say.
All right, before I come to you, Surya, to essentially also come down to the basic question at hand, the reason that we as a South Asian channel are doing this debate is what really it means for South Asia and what it would look like if that build-up does take place. Let's just play of this Cold War redux, some information that we've put up of not just rivalry at play, but essentially what's been going on between the United States and Russia. If we can pull that graphic plate up, essentially talking about how Russia's been expanding or seen to be expanding when it comes to Syria. It's been doing, it's been cooperating with Afghanistan as well. If we can pull up the Cold War redux. US, the perception is unhappy with Russia's muscle flexing in Syria. Though the impression here we had was that US and Russia had some sort of an understanding when it came to Russia's intervention there. US also unhappy over Russia's role in Afghanistan. Russia is increasingly doing more and more. Of course, also close to Central Asian states, and uneasy over implications of Trump's pro-Putin comments. We've discussed that, we've sort of touched on all of this, and I believe we've got Ambassador Malhotra with us as well. He's served in Baltic nations, I'm told. Let me go to Ambassador Malhotra before I come to you, Surya. Sir, right at the end of the debate, I'm sorry I would have time only to give you a question or so, but what does this mean for South Asia, the announcement of this NATO build-up? What would it look like if it does happen? NATO countries say, NATO says that they would do it by early next year.
Well, Anchal, I would say that any build-up of tension between Russia and the West, any further build-up of the tension between Russia and the West is not going to augur well for the region, for the world. In fact, it's not going to augur well for the world peace, and also it will have its own impact on the region. You know, the more West and USA are going to push Russia against the wall, new alignments are likely to appear, particularly in this region. Russia is also is already reaching out to China, and this Russia-China combined may not be really, may not augur well for us. It may not be to our advantage at the end of the day. Well, some of the crucial questions will, bothering are having an impact on our strategic interests may come to the fore. So I don't think it is any rivalry, any further aggravation of relations between the two is good for the world as a whole and also for the region. That's my personal perception. And how it began, we must understand how it began. You know, I've been listening to all the other panelists. We are focusing on the recent, reasons for the tensions between the Russia and the West. But actually, it started with the NATO expansion eastwards and encroaching upon what Russia thought was its backyard, its post-Soviet strategic space. And till there was the weak leadership in Russia, the poor economy, Russia was not in a position to do anything else. After the disintegration of USSR, we had a unipolar world. But with the emergence of Putin, he started reasserting. You know, today they have 28 members. They were only, in 1999, there were 16 members, and all these 12 members were either part of the USSR, the new members I am mentioning, who joined NATO after 1999, they were part of the Soviet Union, or they were part of the Warsaw Pact, or the Soviet space, or the Soviet-allied countries. And then came this question of a missile defense shield. So Russia had to respond, and it responded in an aggressive manner. The Georgia war, how it happened, because on the whole, this situation, as what I want to say is, it has not evolved overnight. It has been building up over a period of last 15, 20 years. And at the end of the day, it is neither good for the world at large and not good for the region.
It's not good for the region. It was inevitable is what the ambassador is trying to say. Surya, I'd like you to come in, and if you would like to ask a question or two from Raymond Vikri as our Russian guest, go ahead. But do weigh in on, the final picture of what it looks like, because here there is a lot of concern that India might then be forced to make a choice, something that India won't like doing.
Yeah, I think India wouldn't want to return to the kind of tensions we saw in the Cold War, when you had to choose between people, between nations. That's something we would avoid. I don't believe we are heading towards that. But I'd like to ask Mr. Vikri, there was a remark made by Ambassador Malhotra that this entire thing has been triggered by America's expansion into the former Soviet space in Eastern Europe. Why did the US do this? I mean, when fully understanding Russia's sensitivities on that score, where was the need for the US to provoke Russia into the kind of actions it has carried out?
Yeah, Mr. Vikri, that was for you.
Yes. I'm saying that the idea that Russia has a sphere of influence, which means it can control Poland, that it can control the Baltics, that it can control Ukraine, it seems to me is a non-starter. These countries are free and independent before they were taken over at the time of the Cold War, and the Iron Curtain descended. That was a completely unlawful and unwise kind of international situation. So certainly we like to step up and help people maintain their independence, maintain their place in the international order. But it's a purely defensive kind of thing. And the idea that somehow you just shouldn't do anything that would upset Russia means, well, why? You first of all hear, well, why is Russia upset? If it has no designs on the control of Poland, Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, then it should have no concern at all. I do agree with Ambassador Malhotra that the rise of tensions between the United States and Russia is a very bad development for the whole world. Nobody wants that, and that was not occurring after the fall of the Soviet Union, really until President Putin decided that he wanted to put the band back together again, if you will.
I think Ambassador Malhotra also said that Putin is asserting itself for the reasons Surya has spoken here of. But I like that Raymond Vickery is talking about how this is US's altruism at play again, and of course, nothing else. Let's give the last word to our Russian guest. I think he hasn't got enough chance to speak. To the Russian expert. Sir, the final word goes to you. How would Russia be responding? The aircraft carrier, we believe, is still on its way to the Syrian shore.
I believe that the military presence in the Mediterranean with our warships, it's not so anti-Western and anti-NATO as it's seen in Western mass media. So I wouldn't see any military development from the Russian side as something anti-NATO and provocative. Some steps are made entirely for short-term goals in Syria, in Middle East, and not necessarily in the West. Anyway, for Russia, NATO remains a key factor in Europe, and I would agree with that. And I would say that without direct dialogue between Moscow and Brussels, between Russia and NATO, it would be very difficult to find stable coexistence of Russia and Western countries in the Europe. And without this...
NATO and Russia did find, I'm sorry to interrupt, I've completely run out of time. NATO and Russia did find ways and means to cooperate. They did form cooperation councils. And Afghanistan is perhaps one example where NATO and Russia actually have cooperated. And Surya, I think South Asia would want NATO and Russia to cooperate. So South Asia is certainly not in that position, certainly not the world. So worrying developments, but let's wait and see what happens in US elections, and then I think we can pick this up. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Our guest from Russia, Ambassador Malhotra, Surya Gangadharan. Raymond Vickery will continue to stay with us. Up next, we talk about India's relentless quest to get into the nuclear suppliers group. Take a short break.